The security woman moved into the doorway before he reached it. Not aggressively, not with any display of force. Just the practiced, economical repositioning of someone whose job was to fill a space before a space could be occupied by the wrong person, and who had developed over years the specific efficiency of someone who made that assessment quickly and acted on it without making it obvious that an assessment had been made. The man approaching the doorway was wearing a dark gray turtleneck, dark trousers, and a watch that told the time without discussing its cost. He was 45 years old, with the kind of face that had been assembled by decisions made over a long time rather than by anything easily categorized. He was holding the hand of his 11-year-old daughter, Safi, who was wearing a cream-colored dress and the expression of a child, who had been promised something worth seeing and was tracking every detail of the approach, with the focused attention of someone who intended to see all of it. The showcase was being held in the upper gallery of the Prentice Building, a private event space in the center of the jewelry district that hosted 4 or 5 events of this kind each year, always by invitation, always with the specific exclusivity of events that understood their own value and protected it accordingly. The entrance was at street level, a discreet door beside which 2 security personnel were stationed, and beyond which, visible through the open inner door, a staircase rose to the gallery floor where the collection was being displayed. The collection was called Mira. It was a suite of 18 pieces in white gold and colored stones, commissioned 18 months ago by a holding company called Safi Stone Group that had retained one of the most respected jewelry designers in the country and had given her complete creative autonomy within a brief that was as simple as it was demanding. Make something that will still be beautiful in 50 years. Make something that earns the stone. The holding company was named after the girl in the cream dress. The man who had founded it was holding her hand. His name was Joseph Adeyemi. He had spent 20 years in gemstone sourcing, specifically in the acquisition and certification of ethically produced colored stones from operations in East Africa and South America, that he had spent the first decade of his career developing relationships with, and the second decade helping to develop sustainably. He knew more about colored stones than most people who bought and sold them ever would, and he had spent the past 3 years doing what people did when they had spent 20 years learning something and had reached the point where the knowledge wanted to become something else. He had commissioned the Mira collection because Safi had been 9 years old and had picked up a piece of raw tanzanite from his desk and held it to the light from the window and said, "Why isn't this something yet?" He had looked at the stone in his daughter's hands and felt the question arrive with the specific weight of a question that was also a direction. He had spent 6 months finding the right designer, a woman named Delphine who worked slowly and thought carefully and had a reputation for making things that were worth waiting for. He had given her the brief and the stones and the time she needed and had not asked for progress reports because he trusted her and because he believed that the best work happened in the specific conditions of trust and time. The 18 pieces had been completed 4 months ago. Tonight was the first public viewing, an invitation-only showcase for collectors, gallery representatives, and press, the specific gathering of people who moved in the world, where objects of this kind mattered and who had been selected because their presence would be meaningful, rather than merely numerous. Joseph had not made a show of his ownership of the collection. The event materials listed Safi Stone Group as the commissioning party and Delphine as the designer, and said nothing further about the individuals behind either name. This was intentional. He had not built this collection to be known as its owner. He had built it because Safi had held a piece of raw tanzanite to the light from a window and asked why it wasn't something yet. The security woman's name was Claire. She was in her early 40s. With the physical economy of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had developed the specific efficiency of someone who made rapid assessments and acted on them with minimal expenditure of energy, she looked at Joseph and Safi and said, "Good evening. This is a private event this evening. May I see your invitation?" Joseph said, "I don't have a physical invitation. My name is Joseph Adeyemi. I should be on the list." Claire looked at the tablet in her left hand. She looked at it with the focused attention of someone who was going to find the answer that was already forming in their mind. She scrolled. She said, I'm not seeing that name on the guest list. Joseph said, could you check under Safi Stone Group? Claire scrolled again. She said, I have a listing for Safi Stone Group, but it shows the registered contact as a company address. There's no individual name attached to the entry. Joseph said, I'm the principal of Safi Stone Group. I'm Joseph Adeyemi. Claire's expression remained professionally neutral. She said, I understand, but our protocol for company listings is to admit individuals who have been specifically named in the invitation confirmation. Without an individual name on the list, I'm not able to grant access. She said this with the flat, practiced finality of someone who had delivered similar sentences many times and had found that the finality was the most useful quality to maintain. Safi had been looking at the inner doorway, at the staircase visible beyond it, at the specific quality of the light that was coming from the gallery above, which was the warm, precise light of a space where things were being displayed rather than merely exhibited, the light of a room where objects had been given the conditions they needed to be seen properly. She had been looking at this light since they arrived. She said to her father quietly, Are those the right lights? Joseph looked at the staircase. He said, What do you mean? She said, For stones. The light should be warm but not yellow. If it's too yellow, the blues look green. If it's too white, the reds look flat. She tilted her head slightly, assessing the quality of the light from where they were standing. It looks right from here. She paused. I want to see it properly. Joseph looked at his daughter. He said, We're going to see it. He turned back to Claire. He said, Is there an event director or a representative from Safi Stone Group I can speak with? Claire said, I can call inside. One moment. She made a call on the radio at her shoulder. The call was brief. She listened more than she spoke. Then she looked at Joseph with an expression that had not changed from the professionally neutral position, but that had acquired a slight additional quality, the quality of someone who had been given information that was being processed without yet affecting the outward presentation. She said, Someone will be out to speak with you shortly. Could you wait just here? Joseph said, Of course. Safi looked at the light from the staircase. She said, While we wait, can I tell you what I think about the display conditions? He said, Please. She said, The temperature looks like it's around 2700 Kelvin. That's good for warm stones, the rubies and the sapphires with warm undertones. But the alexandrite will be tricky. It reads differently in incandescent versus daylight, and if the display lighting is consistent throughout the space, the alexandrite won't show its full range. Joseph said, That's a specific observation. She said, I've been thinking about it since you told me there was alexandrite in the collection. Alexandrite is the only stone in the world that changes color in different light conditions. If you display it in one consistent light, you're only showing half of what it is. Joseph looked at his daughter. He had told her about the alexandrite 6 weeks ago in passing, as one detail among many he shared with her about the collection's progress. She had apparently been thinking about the display implications since that conversation and had arrived, through her own reasoning, at a question that Delphine had in fact raised with the display designer during the installation planning. He said, You're right. Delphine flagged the same thing. Safi said, How did they handle it? He said there are 2 light sources above the alexandrite case. One warm, one daylight. Guests can switch between them with a panel beside the case. Safi looked at this information with the expression she wore when something had been solved correctly. She said, That's good. That's the right solution. She went back to looking at the staircase light. The person who came from inside arrived 3 minutes later. She came through the inner door with the focused energy of someone who had been in the middle of something significant and had interrupted it because what she had been told on the radio had communicated, in the specific brevity of radio communication, that the interruption was warranted. Her name was Miriam, and she was the event director, and she had been working with Safi Stone Group for 8 months on the preparation for tonight's showcase, handling the invitations and the venue and the logistics and the display design and the press coordination and every other element of the event that was not the collection itself. She had corresponded extensively with Joseph's executive assistant and had met Joseph once in a video call 4 months ago when they had discussed the display sequence for the 18 pieces. She recognized his face. She came through the inner door and saw Joseph and Safi standing. Outside it, and the specific quality of her expression communicated, very clearly and without any attempt at concealment, that she understood immediately what had happened and what it meant. She said, "Mr. Adeyemi." Her voice had the quality of a person who was acknowledging a failure and the weight of it at the same time. Joseph said, "Miriam," she said, "I'm so sorry. The guest list was compiled from the invitation database and your entry was registered under the company name without an individual contact attached." She said this plainly without dressing it up. "It's an administrative error that should not have happened, and I take full responsibility for it." She looked at Claire. She said, "Please add Mr. Adeyemi and his daughter to the admitted list." She turned back to Joseph. "Please come in." Claire stepped back. Joseph and Safi walked through the inner door. The staircase was exactly what the light had promised. Wide marble steps with a brushed metal rail, the gallery light becoming more present with each step, the warmth and precision of it increasing as they climbed. Safi climbed the stairs with her hand on the rail and her eyes already on the gallery above and the expression of someone who was arriving at something they had been thinking about for a long time. The gallery itself was a single large room with high ceilings and pale walls, and the specific arrangement of display cases that happened when someone had thought carefully about how people moved through a space and what they needed. From the experience of viewing objects this intimate, 18 cases, one for each piece, each lit with the precise warmth that Safi had assessed from the staircase. The room held perhaps 60 people, moving through it with the considered pace of guests who had come to look rather than to be seen looking. Safi stopped in the entrance to the gallery. She stood there for a moment and looked at the room and then at the nearest case and then at the light and then at the arrangement of cases. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Delphine understood." Joseph said, "What did she understand?" Safi said, "The space between the cases." She looked at the arrangement. "Most showcases put the pieces too close. You end up in competition with the thing beside you. These are far enough apart that each piece has its own atmosphere. You can be with just one thing at a time." She said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone stating an observed truth. Then she walked toward the first case. Joseph walked beside her and watched her look at the collection. He had seen the pieces in Delphine's studio, each one individually during the making process, but he had not seen all 18 together in a display space until tonight. He had held himself back from the installation because he had wanted his first experience of the full collection to be in the conditions it had been made for, under the right light, in the right arrangement, with the space around each piece that allowed it to be fully itself. The first piece was a white gold collar set with a graduated sequence of deep green Colombian emeralds that darkened from a pale spring green at the outer edges to an almost liquid depth at the center. Safi stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "The color graduation wasn't in the brief." Joseph said, "No, that was Delphine's decision." Safi said, "She sorted them herself?" "By color?" He said, "By eye." "Over 3 days." Safi looked at the collar. She said, "You can tell. The graduation is too precise to be accidental, but too organic to be calculated. It looks like it grew that way." She moved to the second case, then the third. She moved through the collection with the pace of someone who understood that things worth seeing required the time they required and that abbreviating that time was a form of disrespect to both the object and yourself. Joseph walked beside her. He looked at each piece with the dual perspective of the person who had commissioned it and the father of the child looking at it, which was a different perspective, larger and more complete than either one alone. The 15th piece was the Alexandrite, a ring of extraordinary scale and restraint, a single stone of exceptional quality set in white gold with the specific simplicity of a setting that understood its job was to hold without competing. The stone was currently under the warm light, showing the deep wine red of its incandescent reading, a red with enough complexity to make you feel you were looking at something alive. Safi stood in front of it for the longest time of any piece in the collection. She said, "Is this the Alexandrite?" He said yes. She looked at it. She said, "Can I see the other light?" He looked at the panel beside the case. He reached out and pressed the daylight switch. The stone changed. Not subtly, completely. The wine red became a deep teal green in a transformation so total it seemed impossible that it was the same object. Safi made a sound, not a word. Just the involuntary sound of someone whose expectations have been exceeded by the reality of something. She said, "It's the same stone." He said, "Yes." She said, "How?" He said, "The stone has two light-absorbing elements in its crystal structure. In warm light, one dominates. In daylight, the other does. The stone itself doesn't change. Only the conditions change." Safi looked at the stone in its daylight reading, the deep teal green of it. And then Joseph switched back to the warm light, and the wine red returned. And she watched the change happen with the expression of someone who was seeing something they were going to think about for a long time. She said, "It's the same stone showing different truths." Joseph said, "Yes." She said, "The truth depends on the conditions." He said, "The stone has both truths in it always. The conditions determine which one is visible." Safi looked at the Alexandrite for another long moment. Then she took out the small notebook she had brought and wrote something in it. She wrote slowly and carefully, the way she wrote things she considered important. Joseph watched her write. He thought about the raw tanzanite on his desk 2 years ago, the question she had asked, the 18 months between the question and this room, this light, this stone showing its two truths in alternating conditions. Miriam appeared beside him. She said quietly, "The press representative from Gemstone Review is asking if they can speak with the commission holder. They're interested in the sourcing story." Joseph said, "I'll speak with them." He looked at Safi. She was still looking at the Alexandrite. The notebook closed now, both hands at her sides, giving the stone the full weight of her attention. He said, "I'll be back in a few minutes." She nodded without turning. She was not done with the Alexandrite. He spent 15 minutes with the press representative, a woman named Harriet who asked good questions about the ethical sourcing protocols and the relationship with the East, African operations and the decision to give Delphine complete creative autonomy rather than specifying a direction. Joseph answered all of it directly and without embellishment, because the story was the story and did not need decoration. When he returned to the gallery, Safi was at the 18th piece, the last in the collection, a bracelet of deep blue Ceylon sapphires set in a sequence that created the specific illusion of movement, as though the stones were arranged not in a fixed position, but in the moment before one, as though the whole thing were about to shift. Safi was looking at it with the same stillness she had brought to the Alexandrite. She said, when Joseph arrived beside her, "This one knows it's the last." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It's the most kinetic. Everything before it is more settled. This one feels like it's still becoming something." She looked at it. "That's the right piece to end with. You leave the room still moving." Joseph looked at the bracelet. He thought about Delphine and the sequencing conversations they had had over 3 sessions. The specific work of deciding what order the pieces should be seen in, the question of what feeling the collection should leave in a person when they reached the end of it. He said, "That's why Delphine put it last. Safi said she was right." He said, "I'll tell her you said so." Safi looked at him. She said, "You can tell her a lot more than that if you want." She found the notebook again and opened it and held it out. He looked at what she had written. She had written 7 observations, 1 for each piece she had taken notes on, and each one was precise and specific, and in the case of the Alexandrite entry, which was the longest, genuinely illuminating in a way that went beyond what most adult observers of the collection had said in his hearing tonight. He looked at his daughter. She said, "Are any of them useful?" He said, "All of them are useful." She said, "You can send them to Delphine." He said, "She's going to want to meet you." Safi looked at this from several angles. She said, "Does she like questions?" He said, "She lives for questions." Safi appeared to find this satisfactory. She looked at the bracelet one more time and then looked at the room as a whole, at all 18 cases in the warm, precise light, at the space between them that allowed each piece its own atmosphere, at the 60 people moving through it with the considered pace of guests who had come to look. She said, "You built this right." He said, "Delphine built it." She said, "You made the conditions for her to build it." That's the same thing. Joseph looked at his daughter in her cream dress in the room above the staircase that they had not been allowed to climb for 3 minutes that felt longer than they were, in front of the collection that had begun 2 years ago with a question about a piece of raw tanzanite and a window. He said, "Yes, I think you're right." She said, "The Alexandrite is my favorite." He said, "I thought it might be." She said, "Because it's the same stone showing different truths." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's what I want to be." He looked at her. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I want to be someone who shows different truths depending on the conditions. Not different in the sense of inconsistent. Different in the sense of the same thing being seen more completely depending on what light is on it." She thought for a moment. "The stone doesn't change. The stone has everything in it always. The conditions just change what people can see." Joseph stood in the gallery and looked at his daughter, who had just described, at age 11, in terms of a gemstone, a way of being in the world that he had spent 45 years trying to live without ever finding the language for it this clearly. He said, "That's the best description of what I've been trying to do my whole career," she said. "I know. That's where I got it from." He said nothing. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, the way she did when she had said something real and was letting it settle. They stood together in front of the last case, the bracelet that felt like it was about to move, and looked at the room that Delphine had designed for the objects that Joseph had commissioned because his daughter had held a piece of raw tanzanite to the light from a window and asked why it wasn't something, yet it was something now. It was exactly something. Miriam came to them near the end of the evening. She said, "I want to apologize again for what happened at the entrance." Joseph said, "I know you do." She said, "I want to understand it properly, not just fix the database. Understand what produced it." She looked at him directly. "When Claire looked at you and made a decision before you had finished your sentence, that was not the database. That was something else. And the database error gave it a structure to operate inside without having to name itself." Joseph held her gaze. He said, "That's an accurate analysis." She said, "I'm going to address both. The system and the thing the system allowed to hide inside it." He said, "How?" She said, "By making explicit in the briefing for events like this one what this kind of event is for and who it is for and what assumptions are not compatible with that. Not as a policy. As a genuine conversation with the team before every event, Joseph said, "That's the right approach." She said, "It came from thinking about what you said to Claire. I'm the principal of Safi Stone Group. You said it without heat, without making it an accusation. You just said the true thing and waited." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to build that into how we approach the door. The assumption that the true thing is often different from the first impression, and that our job is to be open to that difference rather than closed to." Joseph looked at Miriam with a specific quality of attention. He reserved for people who were saying real things in real language about real problems. He said, "When is your next event?" She said, 6 weeks. He said, "I'd like to be part of the briefing." She said, "I was hoping you'd say that." He said, "Safi, too, if that's all right." Miriam looked at Safi, who was writing something in her notebook near the Alexandrite case, her cream dress catching the warm light in the way that cream caught warm light when the light was right. Miriam said, "I think Safi would be the best part of it." They left an hour later. The collection was still being viewed, the guests still moving through the space at the pace of people who had come to look and were not done looking. Joseph and Safi descended the marble staircase and passed Claire at the inner door and walked out onto the street. Claire said, "Good night." She said it with the quality of someone saying something they were also meaning in a way they had not fully understood when they were last speaking. Safi said, "Good night." She said it with the formal courtesy she used for people she had moved from reserved judgment towards something more generous. On the street, Joseph and Safi walked through the jewelry district in the evening, the shop windows lit with their various displays, stones and settings, and the specific language of objects that were designed to last beyond the moment of their making. Safi said, after half a block, "The Alexandrite is the most honest thing I've ever seen." Joseph said, "Why?" She said, "Because it doesn't pretend to be one thing. It contains both things and shows you which one it is depending on the conditions. It doesn't hide the other one. The other one is always there. You just have to change the light to see it." Joseph walked beside his daughter, through the jewelry district, and thought about the stone that showed different truths in different light and about the 11-year-old who had decided she wanted to be like it. He thought she already was. He did not say this. He held her hand, and they walked home through streets that had no record of what he had commissioned, past windows full of things other people had made, through a city that continued its evening without reference to the 18 pieces currently being seen for the first time in a gallery above a marble staircase that had briefly been closed to the man who had made them possible. The door had been closed for 3 minutes. The collection had been 18 months in the making. The stone had been forming for 40 million years. 3 minutes was nothing. The light was everything. He squeezed his daughter's hand. She squeezed back. They walked home through the jewelry district, in the warm light of the evening, showing whatever truth the conditions allowed. That was all. That had always been all.